But basically what we're talking about here is the international requirements for the security for the various materials that come out of InfoCert 225 and comes out of the international modal regulations. So we're up here now adding tools into the international area. You've seen this chart before, and we've talked about the different entities that are parties to the conventions or have agreed, such as with the ADR and the ADN for road and inland waterway. And all of this couples together depending on whether you're making international shipments, by which mode and which countries are involved. The categorization we've talked about in Module 1E. There's two basic levels of categorization: the general provisions for all materials and the additional provisions for high consequence. And again, that term high consequence radioactive material comes out of the UN model regulations and the modal regulations. Security measures required for each level are provided in each of the international modal regulatory documents, and I'm summarizing them here in this module. For nuclear material, same kind of thing. We've talked about the decision process in Module 1F using Decision Chart 3, and I'll be summarizing the requirements that come out of InfoCert 225, and we'll deal with that towards the end of this module. So for this one, radioactive material transport security measures from the international modal regulations are fairly simple. They're fairly straightforward. We have the general security requirements that apply except for the accepted packages that are not in special form. Those requirements are that involved individuals consider security requirements commensurate with their responsibilities. The consigners only offer the material to carriers that have been appropriately identified, is the terms that's used there. Within the United States, I think, for example, DOE has a program for qualifying carriers. Is that right, Jim, Mike? Is that program still in force?
Yeah, our IMSEP program, Motor Carrier Evaluation Program.
Yeah. They should be stored or during in-transit stopping. They should only be kept at secure transit sites, and they provide security awareness training. For the high consequence radioactive material, there's the list of additional requirements that are imposed, that you have proper allocation of responsibilities, records of the materials transported, a review of the current operations and assessment of vulnerabilities, make adjustments to your plan if you find that you have weaknesses. You need to have clear statement of security measures, the procedures for reporting and dealing with the threats, breaches of security and incidents, procedures for evaluating and testing the security plans and procedures. And again, we'll give you an example of how you might do that later in the week. And ensuring the security of sensitive information. As you've seen, NRC Intensifar 73 has a very detailed process for doing that. All of this is what should be in your transport security plan, and that is required for each of the modal regulations. The radioactive material transport measures for, from international modals regulations, the training should cover the nature and recognition of security risks, the methods for reducing those risks, actions to be taken in the event of a security breach, awareness of security plans. Policy should cover response to higher threat conditions and how you deal with new employee and verify their trustworthiness, and what do you do with time to re-verify their trustworthiness. Operating practices, choice and use of routes, very general requirement there, not as specific as in the United States. Access to the radioactive material in temporary storage, it has to be controlled. Again, very similar to the requirements in the US. And you control proximity to the vulnerable infrastructure. Stop a truck at a location, you don't allow people to just wander up next to the vehicle. You have your escorts keeping eyes on the vehicle. Also, the equipment to be used should focus on reducing the security risk, and the resources you use, primarily we're talking here people, are intended to reduce the security risk through armed guards and so on. This comes from IEA NSS 9, providing extensive guidance on how you accomplish all of this. Have an example here, which is the same example we've looked at, and we determined that we had to apply the application box 1C. And here is a summary. I'll let you read that at your leisure of what comes out of 1C that would apply to this very specific shipment if it were being made in Europe by road. In addition, both the RID regulations and NSS 9 recommend the following for your transport security plan. Because the TSP contents are required by the RID are different from those recommended by NSS 9, the operator could consider combining the two sets of measures into their TSP just to have a comprehensive transport security plan. In addition, for example, if the shipment is an international shipment that somehow made it to the United States, crossed the ocean by sea or air, you'd have to apply those requirements. And Module 1G compared the transport security plan requirements for DOT with those of the international air and sea mode requirements. So that refers you back to the comparison we looked at yesterday. The following table adds the recommendations of NSS 9, and all of these could be considered as you develop a transport security plan for this type of operation. What we've got here is the minimum that's required in a transport security plan by DOT, the minimum that's required by ICAO or IMO for air and sea, and what is recommended in NSS 9. So being prudent, you could consider what's in NSS 9 and combine all these together so that you have a comprehensive transport security plan. For example, you'll see that DOT requires confirmation of hazmat worker information. You know who's being involved. Over here, IEA recommends that you verify new employees and employment, whereas the ICAO and IMO are silent on that issue. So just good business practice to look at what is recommended by the different entities and maybe bring it together. This continues that table, continues that comparison. DOT requires that responsible individuals retain a copy of the plan and make it available to DOT or DHS upon request. That's a U.S.-specific requirement. It's not specified for the international side of things. In contrast, the international side specifies that we should ensure transfer interface is secure. Interestingly enough, DOT is silent on that issue. So think about combining those two together. Any questions on radioactive before we move on to nuclear? Like I said, I'm moving fast, so if you got questions, ask them. Here we're talking about the new InfoCert 225 Rev 5, and I'll just remind you that that is new. It is not yet referenced in the International Modal Organization documents. We expect it will be within, I'd guess, 18 months to 24 months. It should be in the new UN Orange Book within the next 6 to 12 months. But within there you have Chapter 6, and it provides some things we haven't really talked about up until now. First of all, the protection against unauthorized removal for material. That's basically these types of security measures we've been talking about. We'll look at those very briefly. I'll spend a little more time on these because it has measures to locate and recover missing or stolen nuclear material. And what you do to protect against sabotage, 3 paragraphs there, and then the measures to mitigate or minimize the radiological consequences of sabotage of the nuclear material. So we'll look quickly at those as well. This just illustrates the graded approach that's used in InfoCert 225 going from the lowest category, that is below Category 3, all the way up to Category 1. So you have the general and common requirements that apply to all of them. Then you have the additional ones for Category 1, 2, and 3, and I've cited here the specific paragraphs out of InfoCert 225 that apply. So that applies to all three. Then you have for Category 1 and 2, you have these additional ones from paragraph 619 to 631. And finally, if it's a Category 1 shipment, you add on the requirements from 632 to 643. And I just note here that some of the Category 1 and Category 2 requirements are mode dependent. So if we look at the first set, very similar to what we've looked at already, and I've just summarized each of these and tied it to the paragraph where it comes from within InfoCert 225, also identified as NSS 13. You have the general requirements, and this applies to all nuclear material. You protect the material against unauthorized removal, et cetera, et cetera. Common requirements that apply to everything. Good logic. Minimize the total time in transport. Minimize the number and duration of transfers. It's in the transferring between carriers or between modes of transport, for example, where you increase the likelihood of success of a terrorist attack. You protect the material during transport and in temporary storage consistent with the material category. And in the various documents, international and domestic, it might say consistent with the level and methods of security that would be used when the material is in use and storage at a fixed facility. You need to look at what level of security you're providing on a fixed facility and try to apply it in this mobile facility, if you will. Avoid predictable movements. Remember a few years ago, talking to Rick Boyle, and he was telling me about a shipper of moly-technetium generators that would send 10 semi-truckloads of generators out between 1 and 4 o'clock on Friday afternoon. And he went to him and said, you really shouldn't be doing this. If you have someone with malevolent intent, they'd look at that and say, hey, that's when I'm going to attack, Friday afternoon, when they're coming out. Don't do everything on a regular schedule. Require predetermination of the trustworthiness of involved individuals. The list just goes on. We've talked about all of these. Ensuring the security of keys. Here's an interesting one that you have to focus on. If you're making international shipments, you need to know what the arrangements and the requirements are in each of the countries you're going through or to. Because as Mike has inferred, when it comes to spent fuel shipments, his experience is that we're more stringent than France, right? So you may find a country that is as stringent or even more stringent than we are. Don't know. Got an example later of what Canada requires. It's interesting. For Category 1, 2, and 3, similar list, paragraphs that it comes from. And there's a list of the things that are required in InfoCert 225 for nuclear materials. Then we move on to just Category 1 and 2. These are additive, so you do everything we've covered up to there, and if it's Category 2, you would add these, or if it's Category 1, you add these. To your transport security plan. Now we're in an area where a transport security plan is required. And it should address at the minimum, and it lists the things that should be in your transport security plan. And then you take into account response force capabilities when choosing the route. Look at what the spacing between them, what they are, if they're local sheriffs, etc. And then finally, moving on, still Category 1 and 2, down here to 6.31. When the materials on board pending departure provide for sufficient access delay or compensating measures to meet the threat assessment or design basis threat. It's kind of similar to a question that Jim asked a little earlier. How do you assess that technically? How do you provide sufficient access delay? That's going to be up to you as a designer of the security system to figure that out. There are additional words in the document that give you guidance on that. Then you have mode-dependent requirements at 631. For road transport, you ship under exclusive use. We'll come back to and compare this with what you have for Cat 1. For rail transport and a freight train, use an exclusive use, fully enclosed and locked conveyance where practicable. For water transport, you transport in a secure, locked, and sealed compartment or container. For air transport, in a cargo-only aircraft and in secure, locked, and sealed compartment or container.
At the previous in regards to 6.29,
Yeah?
what is continuous and two-way voice communication?
You and I are having a two-way communication right now.
But typically the walkie-talkie is not a two-way.
This,
Cell phone is two-way,
yeah.
but the walkie-talkie or something like that is not a two-way. So is it possible?
well, first of all, I think this is a problem of people in the international community trying to write clearly, and in the process they wrote not so clear. But two-way communication would be that I can talk to you and you can talk to me by way of cell phone or radio, whatever I'm using. A one-way communication would be like me listening in on a radio, someone talking on that radio, but I can't talk back to them. So it has to go, we have to be able to communicate both ways. I talk to you. Well, it has.
Radio's one listening all the time and
Yeah.
only talking.
What they're trying to say is that it has to be available to you at all times, and you have to be able to talk back and forth.
That's terrible language.
It is.
Especially if you want to enforce something against it.
I agree. It is not the best language. Okay? For Category 1, much the same thing we've seen before. In here, you use appropriately equipped and trained guards. You accompany each shipment to protect the material. Conduct surveillance of the route. You might even want to do a pre-shipment surveillance to make sure the route is going to be adequate for these Category 1 shipments. Make sure you are capable of being able to initiate an appropriate response. Now here, continuous effective surveillance. They've used continuous in the proper format here. Tie down or attach the package to the conveyance with multiple locking mechanisms. So at the international level, you're required to have locking mechanisms on your package tying it to the conveyance. We don't have that in the U.S. requirement. And here is another interesting part of that. It requires to be unlocked by 2 different keys held by 2 different authorized persons. So you're going to have a lock with 2 different keys, a permissive system. Both keys have to be in, both have to be turned before the lock can be undone. Use a transport control center for monitoring the current position, the security status, alerting response forces, and maintaining continuous, secure, two-way voice communication. So we're back to having that ability to communicate both ways, and it should be available continuously. Protect the TCC against potential threats. Here they're worried about an adversary, instead of attacking the shipment, first attacks your control center. And then who knows what would happen. Staff the transport control center continuously. Provide continuous two-way communication systems between the conveyance, the control center, the guards, designated response forces, and where appropriate, the consignor and consignee. So you reach out to all stakeholders with your communication system in Category 1. Provide redundant, diverse, and secure communications. Guards or conveyance crew report frequently. They don't say how frequently, using two-way voice communication. For road transport, it becomes a little more onerous. You use designated conveyances exclusively for each consignment, preferably specially designed to resist attack and equipped with conveyance disabling devices. That's very similar to U.S. requirement for Category 1. Each conveyance should carry a guard or a crew member in addition to the driver. And each conveyance, road conveyance, accompany each one of these with at least one other vehicle with guards to conduct a surveillance of the route for any threat indicators and to protect the conveyance and initiate an appropriate response. The wording there tells me that the intent of the international community when it says that the additional vehicle should conduct a surveillance of the route, they're driving in front of the load carrying conveyance to look at what is being faced. Generally, I would think that your escort vehicle would be behind so it can monitor what's happening and respond accordingly. But that's what's in the regulations here. For rail transport, accompanying guards travel close to the conveyance. They recognize that you can't travel on the rail car itself, so there'll be a passenger type car close to it, and have proper effective surveillance. That's going to be hard to accomplish when you're in one rail car following another rail car. For water transport,
You also have to have a buffer car between, I believe.
doesn't, in the U.S. we do, I think, yeah. Yeah. Here's one I'm going to ask Mike about. Did you say that in the one case you used a dedicated vessel to get the package?
Right, for the irradiated, Category 2 shipment, we were not required to use a chartered vessel. We ended up having no option besides using a chartered vessel.
Is that no option because of the operators of the vessel? They didn't want to carry it, or?
Well, right, it's in part denial of service and in part allowed just to identify someone who would take a cargo
Yeah.
here from the U.S.
So you're getting into the operational denials problem at that point.
Yeah, denial of service is a big issue when you start talking about this.
Yeah. And for air transport, in a cargo-only aircraft with the material as its sole cargo. That can be an expensive shipment. Okay, well, moving on to the other things that generally we don't find too much in our regulations. Locating and recovering missing or stolen nuclear material. Here's a list of the requirements out of InfoCert 225, that the carrier during transport be alert for any indications that packages have been removed from the conveyance or tampered with. Verify during delivery that no packages are missing or have been tampered with. How do you do that? Why, tamper indicating devices. Carrier takes immediate action to determine if missing packages are misplaced but still under its control. Interesting wording there. They can't find it in the truck, but hey, it might still be back at the point of origination or at a transit point. But that's what's in there. For packages determined to be missing or tampered with, carrier immediately report this to the relevant authorities and the consignor. The carrier provide any requested assistance to locate and recover missing or stolen material, and the carrier should cooperate during subsequent investigations and, interestingly enough, prosecutions, legal action that may follow. And then the carrier cooperate during subsequent investigations and prosecution. That duplicates there. We've seen this for Category 3 and below. You need to account for the radiological nature of the material. And here is a summary of requirements specified there. For physical protection, should your threat assessment indicate even going so far as taking special steps such as postponing the shipment, rerouting the shipment, or enhancing the robustness of the package or the conveyance, in other words, your transport system, performing detailed route surveillance to observe the current environment before you ship, and providing additional guards beyond what you would normally do. Again, providing protection against sabotage. The carrier prepare transport personnel to act in full coordination with guards, response forces, and local law enforcement agencies for implementing the contingency plan. Here we're talking about the carrier, not only the drivers, but people who might be back at the carrier's control center, that they all work in coordination. That's going to have to be part of your transport security plan. The carrier will inform the control center or the carrier management as soon as an attempt or an act of sabotage is detected. A detection may prove, after it's assessed, may prove to have not been a terrorist event, but you still have to make sure you act appropriately. The carrier is to notify in a timely manner the shipper, the competent authority, response force, and other relevant national organizations of sabotage or attempted sabotage as specified in your contingency plan. So here is another specification where you need to have, as part of your transport security plan, a contingency plan. How are you going to respond? And the carrier guards immediately take measures to secure the transport and minimize the consequences of the act. Same example we saw before. I've just given you a guide on where you can find the requirements for that example that we looked at. Won't spend time on that. So in summary, for international shipments to, from, or through the United States, special care must be taken into account for the requirements of all involved states. Always consider every country that's involved. Let me cite an example. Say that you're shipping by surface to a port and you're going to ship by ocean to another country, but you involve a flag carrier of a different country. You also have to look at what the requirements are for that flag carrier and the country it belongs to.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Does the competent authority for those individual states have to approve the transportation and security plan similar to like them certifying a package if you're moving through their state?
Maybe. You'd have to find, yeah, that's where you need to coordinate with those countries and find out what their requirements are. In the safety area, for years we issued annually a list of competent authorities for all the countries. We knew who to go to. Now when it comes to security, I'm not sure whether the agency issues that. Are you aware of that, Mike? I don't think they do. So you're kind of left on your own. You have to go dig it out for the countries involved. The required security measures for the United States may differ. This is just a point we've been making all along. They may differ from the other countries. The international modal regulations currently reference Rev 4. I expect Rev 5 will be coming out, and Rev 5 has been used in this training course.